Institute. I'm here because Craig Jeffrey, the director, is in India doing good work in fostering Australia-India relations, I hope, and in the greater cause of fine research. So I'm your chair for this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay our respects to the Wurundjeri elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who may be with us today, or people from other communities. As I've explained, Craig is in India, and it's my great pleasure to introduce a good friend, a wonderful resource, and one of the most lucid practitioners of the dismal science of economics that I've ever met. I think you'll enjoy hearing him. Amitendu Palit is a senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, which is somewhere I've had the pleasure of working at occasionally over the last 10 years. He's a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. He specializes on international trade and investment, especially relating to China and India. He's an experienced economist who's worked for a number of years in the government of India, in ministries of finance, industry, and civil supplies, been involved in the annual economic surveys, which are an institution in Indian public life, and also in the preparation of the Indian budget, one of which has just been brought down in the past week. He's the editor and author of a number of books, but the most recent, and I have a copy in my bag if anybody would like to see it afterwards, 7 Decades of Independent India, a wonderful anthology of 70 years of India brought out last year to commemorate 70 years since 1947. He also writes a regular column for the Financial Express, one of India's leading business dailies. You can follow him on the web if you're so inclined. And he's a frequent resource for radio and television. I think you'll find that he's lucid, amusing, and we can learn a lot from him. He's also very concise and usually jargon-free. His topic today, and it falls into the keywords series of lectures that the Australia-India Institute has been prosecuting now for three or more years. The topic is governance, and with particular reference to farm loan waivers, bad economics, poor politics. And it will be, I think, of particular interest to people here because it does revolve around, the talk revolves around banking. And as of yesterday, I think most Australians have turned their thoughts towards banks and banking. And we may learn a little bit more about the problem of banks, banking, and bankers as we listen to Amitendu today. He'll speak for between 30 and 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for questions at the end. So Amitendu, please come and give us your remarks.
Thank you, Robin, and as always, you've been more than generous, much more generous than you should have been. But well, I know Robin for a while, but I think this is the first time he's chairing me, Robin, if I'm not mistaken, the first occasion. So that's a first for me, a first which I'll keep with me. It's a memorable occasion. The second time I'm back at the Australia-India Institute. Again, wonderful visit. Lovely to be with you all today in the evening. It's a bit of a, I would say, slightly morbid topic which we are looking at today, but something which is of great interest, not just for us all here today or those following India, but I think this is a subject which will live on for many years for those interested in India. So let me try to first set out what I'm trying to do here. This is a keywords lecture, and when I went through the book that Craig and another of my very good friends, Professor John Harris, had drafted on keywords for modern India. And Craig had asked me to choose between security and governance as one of the picks for this lecture. As you know, economists don't think much before they commit to actions, they think much later. So as being a trained good economist, I didn't think much when I picked governance. And I realized after looking at Craig's book that the word governance doesn't feature among the keywords. So I guess I'll have to make a contribution to some respect. And when I came back and looked at this subject in the larger context of governance in India, There are imperfections galore. But what is striking is that when one looks at India as a country, and typically the word farmer, the community of farmers, creates a variety of images in the minds of people when they look at India. But farmers and India are at least conceptually inseparable from each other. And that will remain, notwithstanding the leaps taken in IT, artificial intelligence, digitalization, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a community which continues to remain central to most conversations that are happening in India from a political, social, economic, anthropological perspective. And one of these subjects concerned with farmers, which has been of great traction in the last 15 to 20 years, is that farmers in India are unhappy. They're unhappy to the extent that some of them are actually taking their lives. Farmers are also unhappy because a large part of India is progressive. Farmers are not, at least many farmers are not. And it's a matter of political concern, it's a matter of economic concern, and answers don't seem to be flowing. One of the readily available solutions, one can, as I describe it, is a kind of a patchwork solution, is the fact that farmers have been in a state of distress because of their mounting indebtedness. So just get rid of this indebtedness. The state has the capacity to get rid of the indebtedness, so write off the loans, and they will become happy, and the votes will come. What I argue in my lecture today is that farm loan waivers are not the solution to removing farmers' distresses. The main problem arises from the fact that farmers' incomes are not rising in India. And what is going on in India today, on the guise of providing help to the farmers in terms of a variety of schemes, is much about political optics. The real central question of how farmer incomes can increase is something which is not being addressed. So that, to me, is a colossal failure of governance in India, because this essentially comes down to a point that institutions, markets, and policies are not backing up each other in a way in which they should have for a very long time, for enabling farmers to increase their incomes. So, the long and short of my lecture is that. Now let me just try to make it sound less morbid and less, just if I could. So, that's kind of my introduction, the farm loan waivers in India, and kind of, without delving into tantalization, I call it bad economics, certainly, and also poor politics. So I don't see much good about it. You see, this is a scenario where, we are looking back. Today it's the 5th of February 2019, and if we go back for less than 10 years, we have seen this building up in India. Indian states, and India is a country of 29 states and 7 union territories. Indian states have been competing with each other, if one can put it that way, to project themselves as sympathetic to the cause of the farmers as possible. And one of the upshots of this has been that since April 2017, you have had these many states, and for those of you who are familiar with India, you will realize that all these states are actually big and populous states. They're not small. So beginning from the eastern coastal state of Andhra Pradesh, as one moves southward, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, as one moves back into the hinterland, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, one moves further up onto the northeast, Assam, further west, Punjab, all the states have in their own respective ways tried to waive off the farmers' loans as a solution for tackling the agricultural distress, which is essentially a situation where farmers are unhappy with the prices that they're getting for their crops, and as a result of that, they're not able to retain a substantial commercial surplus for them. Many of them, as a result, are not able to effectively service the debts that they have taken up from banks. And the governments have been taking the view that if these debts are not insisted upon from the farmers, if the states take the responsibility of writing off these loans, then farmers will be back to square one in a happy state and frame of mind. What this has led to till now is about almost 1% of India's GDP being committed to being written off when it comes to farmer loans. There's a precedence, but this is not just the last 2 years that we have seen this, and there are three people in this slice, and one of them on the left, those of you familiar with India would identify this gentleman as the Prime Minister of a rather short-lived government that India had in the years 1989 and 1990. His name was Mr. V.P. Singh, and he was leading a National Front government, and during his time, for the first time, there was a one-time waiver of agricultural loans announced in the only budget that his government presented, which amounted to write-offs of around 100 billion rupees. And then, of course, this distinguished gentleman and the lady, Dr. Manmohan Singh and Mrs. Sonia Gandhi, the Prime Minister of the United Progressive Alliance and the chairperson of the United Progressive Alliance in the year 2008, the Congress-led United Progressive Alliance government, which waived off again as a one-time settlement around 600 billion rupees of outstanding farmer loans. So there is a history to this rush that has built up now. And well, there's also this view that many of you might have reached from the conversations that are going on in India, that during the year 2018, the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is the party of the Prime Minister of India right now, Mr. Narendra Modi, his party suffered quite a few electoral setbacks in state assembly elections in India. And the main opposition party, Congress, has come back to power in quite a few of these states. And in all the states that they have come back, they have actually waived off the loans of farmers. And that might lead some to the impression that it's just the Congress which is employing this as an electoral tactic, as a tactic for winning back the farmers among its voting constituencies. But it's not just the Congress. It's kind of something which is a herd effect across political parties in India. The gentleman on the top left, Mr. Chandrababu Naidu, Chief Minister of the state of Andhra Pradesh, who belongs to the regional Telugu Desam party. The gentleman on the top right, Chief Minister of India's largest state of Uttar Pradesh, Mr. Yogi Adityanath, belonging to the Bharatiya Janata Party, Mr. Modi's own party. Gentleman on the bottom left, Mr. Devendra Fadnavis, Chief Minister of the Indian state of Maharashtra, again belonging to Mr. Modi's Bharatiya Janata Party. And finally, on the right, Mr. K.R. Chandrasekhar Reddy, Chief Minister of the state of Telangana, having the regional party TRS. So it's the BJP, it's the regional parties, along with the Congress, at the state level, who are all into the game of demanding loan waivers. Now, this is one subject on which I would say not the prince in waiting, but the gentleman who is now, in a sense, fairly at a core of a political narrative that is building up in India against Mr. Modi and his politics and policies, Mr. Rahul Gandhi, the chief of the Congress party. He has kind of been building up his campaign with the 2019 general elections that are due within a few months. Building up his campaign, keeping the farmers' distress and the policies surrounding that distress central to the narrative. And he has been making statements which are substantive, which are, in a sense, aimed at puncturing the claim that Mr. Modi had launched off quite a few years ago, which was that farmers' welfares are central to his policies and he would try his best to double the farmers' incomes. And he has been, sort of making statements that the loans or rather loans being waived off, is a right that the farmers have, and the Congress will pay heed to those rights. And wherever the Congress comes back, they will waive off the loans. And in fact, 4 days before the last union budget that was announced last Friday, 4 days before that, in an election rally, he actually went ahead and said that the Congress would announce a minimum income guarantee for everybody in the country, not just farmers, if it is voted to power in the next elections. So it's basically a political story that is building up from the distress of farmers. The fact that they are unhappy, they're not getting their dues, indebtedness is square and central to their existence. This indebtedness must be tackled, and for that, the loans need to be written off. And that argument can be taken forward to the argument of farmers being provided an assured income. And that's the plank on which the Congress and much of the opposition parties are basing their forthcoming electoral agenda. And this is where the BJP is kind of at a wrong foot to address this campaign head-on, simply because it doesn't have enough results to contradict this narrative. And it's appearing to be running out of ideas in countering this narrative. There's also a result of the fact that in almost all the states where the BJP has been at the receiving end over the last year and a half, including Prime Minister Modi's own state of Gujarat, where actually his party came back to power with a much reduced majority than was expected, the farmers' distress was supposed to have been the main reason behind the lower number of votes that the BJP faced. So in a sense, it is an aggrieved constituency. And that constituency will probably have a role to play in the political verdict that the general elections will see in sort of, I think, 12 to 14 weeks' time. But let's try to look at this a little bit more closely. Let's assume that indebted farmers get their loans waived off, and a government comes to power. It promises to write off all the outstanding loans. Now, who's benefiting out of this story? Now, the first point is that when one looks at India's rural sector, who are we talking about? Broadly speaking, there are two categories of farmers. Farmers who own lands and farmers who don't. This second category of farmers are those that are usually referred to as agricultural laborers, in the sense that they work as farm hands when output is being cultivated, or they also can be attributed to as tenant farmers, in the sense that they hire plots of land which they don't own and on which they invest on their own and cultivate. Now, all loans that are given out to farmers are based on the collaterals which they can produce. And among these collaterals, land is fundamental. It's non-negotiable. So what that essentially means is that more than 50% of the rural workforce that comprises of landless peasants don't have access to formal loans. So any scheme that writes off agricultural loans doesn't make an impact on these people. Then among the farmers who are indebted, who are unable to service their loans, you can divide them into two categories. One who are able to access the formal banks and institutions and loans, the others who can't access those but fall victim to money lenders for the ease of lending from the informal sources. So obviously the second category again is another which gets excluded from the category of formal loan waiver eligible beneficiaries. So its calculations show that roughly 30% of total agricultural households in the country might be taking loans from banks, and any loan waiver scheme at any level is limited in its benefits to only this 1/3 of the agricultural workforce and the peasant and farming community. Now, among these, we are slowly getting into the sphere of governance here. How does one qualify for a loan waiver? It's rocket science. It's not if that I hold a loan, I'll be automatically waived. Well, I have to prove that I'm eligible for a waiver, right? So, and as we economists are always fond of saying, there are necessary and there are sufficient conditions. So the necessary condition to qualify for a loan waiver is that I hold a loan. But the sufficient condition to get that loan waiver is that I submit all the documentation that I need to do to the satisfaction of the authorities. And these documentations are extensive. Because let's remember, the documentation is a part of the process of the banks, and no bank is happy to let their limits go off. They'll try to ensure that under all circumstances, these loans are recovered back. It's under political pressure that they are unable to do that. So just make lives as difficult as possible. So what that happens is, imagine a farmer, and a farmer goes through various agricultural seasons and cycles. When the first agricultural season kicks in, and there is a loan waiver announcement that comes in, and the farmer has his loan to be paid in various installments. So when the first waiver installment comes in, by the time his next installment to be paid is already due. If he is good in his documentation work, if he has some knowledgeable people in his community and neighborhood who are helping him with the paperwork and the rest of the requirements around it, by the time he gets to the second installment payment, he might get a signal from a bank that, yes, we have received all your documents. To our satisfaction, we are processing those. By the time the possession decision comes, is on to the third waiver. The interests keep piling up. It's a perpetual cycle. All of us who have taken loans at some periods of time in our life, and we have paid equal monthly installments or equal yearly installments, we know how it works. And the average Indian farmer is not an exception to that. So all that means is that this entire loan waiver game has two central elements to it. A, it has a systemic bias towards more resourceful farmers who know the documentation game better than the others, who have the capacity and the linkages with institutions to finish those requirements faster than others. And number two is that because of this cycle, which it inherits, on most occasions, the decision to waiver and the nominal value, the nominal relief that the farmer gets from that is actually cancelled by the interest that keeps on piling on him on the next installments. Then let's look at it from the point of view of a farmer. What goes on in the mind of the farmer at that stage? Now, obviously, a farmer is going to vote thinking that if he votes for a political party, or at least the parties which has promised loan waivers, they would waive off his loans. So then the farmer goes into the election verdicts come, the loan waiver is announced, and the farmer knows that a waiver is in the pipeline. He goes slow. He has to go slow. I mean, it's holiday in the pipeline, so why should I walk fast? It generally goes so, expectation builds up, don't really need to work too much. You know, whatever you owe, whatever you have invested is not going to be returned. But what happens to the guy who's been working hard to pay the installments on time? He or she feels cheated. That this is not the way it should have happened, because I have, at my own end, done the best to service the loan that I picked up. And remember, agriculture lending is a priority for financial institutions in India. Right? So loans go out on a priority basis. There are farmers who pick up loans. There are small farmers who actually work tirelessly, and not just from cultivation, but from non-farm occupations as well, including shifting to the cities, working there, getting that money for paying back the loans which they have on their produce. What happens to them in the event of a loan waiver? I mean, the effort goes down the drain. So it's actually a vicious cycle in that respect. And now if you look at the other sector, and it's not going to be a fallacy if I say that probably the worst economic problem or the worst sector that is affected now in India among all sectors, or which is in the worst state of health, is clearly the banking sector. The banking sector in India is saddled with huge non-performing loans. Now, there's a view out here, and there's a certain degree of politics which is going around this view as well. Bulk of the non-performing loans that government banks in India are holding on to are essentially from, let's say, 70, 80, 100 chosen corporate accounts. And there's a view which has come out from certain politicians that if loans from these corporate accounts cannot be recovered, why should they be recovered from the poor farmers? Well, the logic to the other side is that you have stopped lending to these corporate accounts. And should you stop lending to the farmers as well? If you're forgiving their loans. Because if loans are forgiven on part of a customer, the creditworthiness of that customer goes down in the eyes of the bank. Non-performing loans start building up. As a result, down the line in the medium term, there is no way the credit flow to the agricultural sector can go up. Because the creditworthiness of the sector itself suffers a serious dent. And when this happens, banks start demanding more and more recapitalization. So it's a complicated game that goes on in terms of both the expectation of the farmers and both the expectation of the banks. What it affects in an even more serious way is the financial stability or the fiscal condition of individual states, and this is a table which shows that from the time the loan waivers have been announced by various Indian states, each of them have experienced an increase, depending upon the size of the loan that they have given up in the fiscal conditions. So then what are you left with? Well, loan waivers, I think for the first time when the Congress went on a rampage on the loan waivers, announced loan waivers in the 3 states when it won elections in the month of November and December, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Telangana. And in the huge, severe political criticism that came out, ultimately even the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, along with a large number of other people, started admitting that, look, loan waivers don't work. Now, this doesn't explain why their own governments have been giving loan waivers, but obviously loan waivers don't work. It's an economically suicidal step. It's not going to benefit the economics on either side. Well, there might be some short-term political logic to it, just on the periphery at that point in time. But ultimately, this is taking on too much for the exchequer, which cannot be swallowed, nor can it be thrown out. So the conversation gradually shifts to another alternative. Now, this is an alternative, which is an alternative coming from the principle of a universal basic income for Indians. This alternative is not just concerned with the fact that farmers are not getting a right income, but is also concerned with the fact that joblessness in India is rising at a precariously fast pace. And that's just because of the fact that jobs are not growing. Not growing not because of anybody's fault, it's just that the character of job-producing industries and enterprises are changing very rapidly. Maybe the number of jobs that are coming up, while being much less, are much better in quality. But nonetheless, India needs to produce roughly 1 million new jobs per month. And the country is, well, let me not get into comparisons, but let's forget about millions. Jobs are not even coming up in hundreds. Now, what does that mean? There's a huge teeming population which is ready with a certain amount of diverse skills, ready to join the workforce, but there's no work. Now, in this kind of a situation, one of the options which many have been thinking about variously is whether India can shift to a system of a universal basic income, which would be a state handout. Now, this, whether it can come into India at some stage or other, is a different question. But what has been brought onto the table as a part of this concept, and specifically with the farming community in mind, is that, look, let's not go into loan waivers, that's not going to help. Let's try to see if a income can be provided to the farmers by the state. It will be a direct income support, which will flow directly into the farmer's account. And the first step to do this was the state called Telangana in India's east coast. Telangana is a product of the original state of Andhra Pradesh, which was bifurcated in 2014 into two states, one of which retains the name Andhra Pradesh, the other is the new state of Telangana. And that's the Chief Minister of Telangana who actually initiated this scheme called Raithu Bandhu. Raithu is a word in Telugu which means the farmer, and Bandhu is the friend. So it's basically the farmer's friend. And this is a scheme which aims to give out rupees 4,000 per acre per season to each farmer, capped at rupees 8,000 per acre in a year over two farming cycles. It's essentially a support for the investments that the farmer is doing. Now, obviously each scheme has its downsides. And one of the downsides of this scheme is, I think, two prominent downsides. One is that there's no cap on the number of acres, in the sense that if a farmer has 5 acres, he or she would be getting more than a farmer with 2 acres. So there's no cap on that, as long as the eligibility conditions are good. Second, again, this is a scheme which excludes the tenant farmers and the agricultural laborers. To back this, in about a month ago, the eastern Indian state of Odisha came up with another scheme which is a different version from the one which Telangana has produced. The main feature of this scheme is that it allows support. It is primarily focused on the small and marginal farmers who have holdings up to 2 acres of land. And for the first time, this is a scheme which looks like landless levels, gives them a direct income support for investment in a large number of rural activities which are not connected directly to cultivation. Let's say, for example, fisheries, mushroom cultivation, beekeeping, so on and so forth, which are sort of non-firm agricultural activities. A large number of activities do engage this agricultural laborers because they have to keep shifting between multiple occupations for making ends meet. There's a promise of an interest-free crop loan, but the number of beneficiaries, the absolute number of beneficiaries to this support, to whom this support can go out in a year, is capped at a finite number. The interesting part here is that, and this is where I suppose the politics come in. Let me digress for a moment and look at the Indian elections that are coming up. Now, this is an election where now the BJP under Mr. Modi is actually pressing for a tough fight. And when major political parties in India like the BJP or the Congress anticipate tough fights, it's music for regional parties in India. India has at least 7 or 8 regional parties which have the capacity on a 5-year cycle to come up with a bag of 25 to 40 seats, depending on which region they proliferate in and where they hold the sway. And these regional parties are in a commanding position to actually determine the final electoral and government outcomes. Now, these two gentlemen, the one shown in the earlier slide as the Chief Minister of Telangana, and this gentleman, the Chief Minister of Odisha, are two parties with whom the BJP has been having very serious conversations. In fact, Mr. Naveen Patnaik, the Chief Minister of Odisha, had actually been a part of the alliance with the BJP. Today, even the TRS under Mr. Reddy from Telangana is expected to be a frontline ally of BJP when it goes into the executive. Now, and the BJP needed to come out with a response to the Congress charge that, Narendra Modi sleeps while farmers die. So it was kind of expected that the BJP would come out with something in response to the Congress's charge and also in lines of what its potential allies are doing in their respective states. And that's what came out last Friday in the budget that was announced on the 1st of February. So what you have is the Prime Minister Kisan Samman Nidhi scheme. I'm not going to translate this into Hindi, into English from Hindi, but roughly what it means is it is a scheme. The word Kisan means farmer, Samman means prestige. So it is essentially a scheme which is looking to safeguard the prestige of Indian farmers in a substantive fashion by supporting them in their difficult times. Rupees 6,000 per year for small farmers. Woefully little amount of money. I mean, we all know that peanuts fetch monkeys, but even by those standards, this is woefully little. 120 million farmers targeted. So he has taken, this budget has taken a little bit of both Odisha and Telangana schemes. Some amount of money dedicated on the basis of the agricultural seasons and cycles. A large number of farmers capped. Find it, this is a central government support that is coming up. Targeted at small farmers. The outlay is phenomenal. I think this is where the economics go completely wrong. 75 billion rupees committed under this scheme, which I think would be roughly coming out to something like 12 billion American dollars, if I'm not mistaken. The largest outlay to come into the budget after the food subsidy and the defense programs. This is huge. But even with such huge sum, it doesn't make a difference. 6,000 rupees a year, which is 500 rupees a month, which is roughly, I would say, maybe 10 Australian dollars a month. Now, this, under no circumstances, can be expected to make a major difference to the economic condition of the impoverished and indebted farmer. Whether he or she gets to that waiver is a different thing, but it doesn't make a difference. Now, of course, by doing so, what the government has done, it has compromised on the fiscal health and discipline. So, what we are now facing is actually a very counterproductive political optics. And let's just try to sum up this story. Agriculture in India contributes to less than 15% of the total economy. If one looks at purely in terms of the contributions that manufacturing does, services does, agriculture contributes just under 15%. But it continues to support almost 2/3 of the livelihoods in the country, in some way or other. So what that means is that if one looks at a country of 1.3 billion people, and if one looks at 60% of that 1.3 billion, 700 million plus people have their livelihoods connected to agriculture in some way or other. By all yardsticks, a sizable chunk of the votes. So one can easily figure out why this is a sensitive constituency and why getting the arithmetic right for them is important. So the political motivation behind safeguarding this constituency is fine, but the challenge over here is that how does one do that? Because the core issue is that farmers' incomes are not rising. How does one make the farmers' incomes rise? Loan waivers are not the solution. Loan waivers are just ways of applying a balm to a disease which is chronic genetically. I mean, that balm is not a cure. The balm is just a temporary heal. It might at best be a painkiller, to last for 48 hours, but it's not a lifelong cure. Go for minimum income schemes in that case, a little better than loan waivers, but even those don't guarantee farmers the higher incomes. But what it does is that this sheer desperation to do something for this extremely important political constituency has launched off a race to the bottom. A race to the bottom among all political parties in India. The BJP, the Congress, several of the regional parties. It's a race to the bottom in a pit where the bottom is approaching fast. Because it's just a question of giving away, as much as you can, and the capacity of the state to give away is finite, and the limits are visible, pretty much visible on that. This is where I think the clear role of this problem in terms of characterizing it as a governance becomes very clear, because farmers' incomes can't rise unless and until what they're producing fetch higher prices. And there are three important things for doing that. Even today, for an Indian farmer, it's extremely difficult, almost impossible to sell in the open market. Farmers operating in the villages are mandated to offload their produce to state-determined and state-identified commission agents. There are a bunch of acts operable at the state level which are called APMC, Agriculture Produce Marketing Committee Acts, under which the state government, the local panchayats assign commission agents, and there's nobody else to whom the farmer can actually sell. The farmer doesn't have the ability to reach the open market. It's been going on for an extremely long time in terms of a conversation that this APMC Acts have to be amended. Some states have partially amended this, but the problem over here is that APMC Acts are very, very stubborn pieces of legislation. Extremely difficult to amend, and I'll explain why. Apart from the fact that these acts prohibit farmers from reaching a wider base of customers, Indian farmers are the most vulnerable victims of perishability. Whatever they produce perishes. Let's say, for example, anything that the farmer produces in terms of tomatoes, potatoes, mushrooms cannot be stocked. The facilities are just not available. The cold storages are not available. The warehouses are not available. And forget about the farm-to-table concept. That doesn't exist. Because these would require investments, huge, large investments. And the third point is that there is no effort to switch the farmer in terms of his produce from the domestic market to the international markets, which obviously would fetch higher price premiums. In all these three are practically non-negotiable from a political perspective. One, the first is going to make the local trader and the intermediary extremely unhappy. Because there's a very large segment of local agents who profit from the fact that farmers sell only to them. And they are mandated by the state to collect their produce. This is evident from the fact that even a state like Maharashtra, arguably India's most industrially developed state with its capital at Mumbai, having a BJP government with a clear, strong majority, got this APMC Act to the Assembly and had to take it back. It couldn't do it. The pressure of the intermediaries as a functional lobby is enormous. You can't invest in Kochi and ask me why. Who will invest in Kochi? Only the one with deep pockets. And who has the deep pockets? Well, there are people with deep pockets in India, but they're interested in far shorter, shallower benefits than investment in cold storage. This requires foreign retailers to come in. And obviously, that's going to make a large number of people unhappy in the entire scheme of things. Again, if you encourage farmers to switch to the international markets, well, the local traders remain unhappy because they can't profit from the intermediation business. So all three, politically non-negotiable. And more about governance. This is my concluding slide. Look, I think I will, from a personal note, conclude by this way. There's no in-principle objection to the fact that if direct income support is provided to Indian farmers, there's nothing wrong with it. Let it come. Back up farmer investments by income support. But that does not preclude the state from making these three other factors function. Let the market start working. Let you amend the acts and let the farmers at least get a taste of the market. and be able to sell either online or offline, or through some other combination of the two, directly to the consumers. Let the institutions develop which can regulate the warehouses, which can regulate the standards, which can be effective agencies in ensuring that farmers have the information about the markets. And they can go to the right spots, identify the signals, they are literate from a market sense, they are aware about the standards, they know about the customer tastes and preferences. Let those institutions have. And finally, let the policies function. There has to be a few policies which at least give farmers the confidence that, look, when I set out to produce, I won't have to wait for the government of India to announce a price, a procurement price, which is the price at which I will target to sell my produce, but I know in my heart of hearts I will never get that price, because that price is available only if I sell my food grain to the Food Corporation of India, and the entire bloody country of India has 4 godowns of the Food Corporation of India, which I cannot reach. By the time I even envisage reaching those godowns, I will probably be in a position where I am taken out by the intermediaries. So if 800 rupees is offered for a quintal, I get caught midway by an intermediary who tells me that, look, don't worry about the transport costs. Getting from Kerala to a godown in Andhra Pradesh will cost you far more than 800. You might as well sell that to me for 300 and go back with your money. And I'll deliver, I'll see that it reaches the right place. So this 500 rupees becomes the margin of the intermediary. This has been a common practice. This has worked in India for years altogether. And that procurement is a function which is actually a vacuous function, because the government procures, and then where does the food grain go? Maintaining those food grains becomes a huge challenge for the states. There's a cost to procurement as well. And one just can't let this grain flow out through the public distribution system to the ration shops, because the ration shops have now become targeted, right? And rotten food can always find its way back into the system. So it's a vicious cycle of governance imperfection. The farmer must have wider choices. The farmer must be able to overcome these bottlenecks in the system for selling to the people who matter, who can give him or her a sufficient number of quality-based and quantity-based choices. Let this market institution policy nexus be actually developed in a holistic fashion. In parallel to that, one can play on, let us say, income support and other populism with a political focus on mind is fine. But the problem is that, if one lends to competitive populism, which is happening in India right now, we would say that if wishes were horses, competitive population would stop. The problem is that I think Indian political parties probably make a fundamental mistake. They underestimate the intelligence of farmers. I think the farmers know pretty well that, look, it's not the first year or the first month when I'm in trouble. I've been in trouble all through. There are better offs in my community who have benefited. But by and large, we have not benefited from the policies because we don't have sufficient resources. We have been having low incomes for a large number of years. The problem is that why do you now, with the general elections 3 months away, come up with a scheme which is supposed to be the solution to all my problems, and I will not remain hungry and go to sleep peacefully at night? If this was the panacea for all my ills, it would have been announced 10 years ago. The fiscal situation then would have been as bad as it is now. So I think this is where there is a serious problem. I would argue that such competitive populism for political parties can actually produce a backlash. And we have seen these visuals of angry farmers on the streets. These are not going to go away. Farmers are clearly conscious of the fact that political parties might be displaying a lot of space in their narratives on them, but that is not with the objective of addressing their welfare. That is with the objective of addressing their own political welfare. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Amitendu, for an immensely lucid and educational presentation. We've got probably 10 minutes for some questions. The gentleman here, yeah.
My question is, that first thing I would like to know which category of
perhaps use the microphone just for
which category of farmers they commit suicide. You have told 2 or 3 categories. That is one thing. Second thing, could the insurance be an alternative for that?
Well, I think when it comes to category of farmers committing suicide, look, obviously farmers' suicides arise because of a number of fashions, but most of the studies point to the fact that farmer suicides are most in states where farmers belong to communities where the inability to return loans creates an enormous amount of social pressure. The pressure is much more socially than from the financial institutions. It's considered to be a shame socially among the neighborhood and community that the farmer is unable to service the loan and pay back the loan on time. I mean, so for example, in an average Indian farmer household, this might become a situation when the farmer's children are subjected to social pressure because of their parents' inability to return the loans. And this could be in a large number of states of India, depending upon the circumstances and pressures. We have seen this happening in Andhra. We have seen this happening in Maharashtra. It's also connected to the fact that very often in a large number of states, farmers switch their crop cycles very rapidly from one crop to another with the hope of making a greater surplus. That surplus doesn't materialize, and the farmer doesn't have enough with him or her to sell in the market because the prices crash. So I think this is actually more than a regional phenomenon. This is more a cyclical phenomenon across the country. But I would argue that in those states where farmers have been able to access the markets better, and states where the inequity among land holdings is much less. It's more small to medium land holdings rather than land holdings being distributed in a fashion where there's much more on the higher side as opposed to a lower side. Are states where farmer suicides are relatively less. You mentioned insurance. Yes, certainly insurance can make a big difference. But insurance, again, is something which has been available to Indian farmers for several years. I mean, there has been crop insurance, there has been input failure insurance. Let me try to argue this point a little more clearly. There are policies in place. The problem, I suppose, is more in getting the results of the policy to the beneficiaries. The mere fact that an insurance policy has been announced for farmers does not mean that, this 2/3 of the country's population, which is part of the rural economy, will actually in any way totally, wholly benefit from this policy. Maybe 5% of them will, maybe 10% of them will, depending upon their ability to be eligible, depending upon their ability to actually access the institutions. So I think that is where, again, it comes down to the question of governance. That whether announced policies are obtaining their desired benefits. And I think there are still very large gaps left up in this regard.
Or the gentleman here and then Bob Smith. There we go.
In fact, my question is on small holdings itself. I've been talking to a few friends of mine, I'm not an expert on this subject, who have been telling me that small holdings itself is the main problem in India. And these small holdings actually, I don't know, you are an expert, tell us, actually cannot lead to the type of market situation you are talking about. That's my first thing, and one small thing. Despite all the problems, and despite so much of farmer suicides and all that, and the issues of agriculture and dependent on rural areas and all that, India is still self-sufficient in food.
Look, let me put it this way. The first question on small holdings. I think small holdings are clearly a result of the fact that the number of people depending upon land for productive use is very large. It's the sheer pressure on the land which leads to fragmentation. Even when agricultural families need to establish the rights to succession over a plot of land, the right to succession itself leads to a fragmentation of those holdings among the next generation. So there's no way the fracturing can be stopped. Small holdings are counterproductive from an economic sense, which was realized after the Green Revolution that India had almost 50 years ago, that these holdings require a minimum size for the modern inputs to yield the kind of results they should on productivity. But I suppose that today's agricultural practices have gone well beyond that, and there are a number of agricultural practices which are actually size neutral, and to that extent can also provide farmers an opportunity to produce something which is size neutral. I also firmly believe in the fact that, a farmer doesn't engage in subsistence earning out of choice. Today, if the farmer had the choice in greater rural non-firm activities which provide him or her with higher incomes, he or she would have taken the choice. It's just that the choice is not available. If migration to more remunerative opportunities was possible, the choice would have been exercised. We have been talking about manufacturing not being able to shift the large number of farmers out into industry. That hasn't happened. But there are many other alternative occupations which would have come up, and that really hasn't happened. I'm sorry, what was your second question on?
India, despite all these negative things, whatever your view is, India is still self-sufficient in food production.
India is self-sufficient when it comes to cereals. And let me make that distinction pretty clear. India is very self-sufficient when it comes to cereals. The interesting part is that farmers have always been encouraged to produce cereals. They have never been encouraged to produce non-cereals. If you look at the consumption pattern of Indians, it's undergone a phenomenal change from what it was in the 1970s to today. Much more of Indians today consume dairy products, poultry products, much more of vegetables. India is not sufficient in those, or can be more sufficient on those because it's not just a question of these being available raw. Now there's a huge demand for processed food. But the pity is that a lot of cultivated output, let's say mushrooms, let's say tomatoes, let's say potatoes, go to waste because they can't be stored and they can't be put into processing. So this is essentially again an infrastructural shortcoming and a governance gap. Whereas in cereals, I think today the last budget announced on the 1st of February that there are 22 crops for which the government has decided that the procurement price will be 50% higher than the cost price. Right? Now, obviously, this would mean that from now on, the focus of bulk of the farmers would be on those 22 crops. I mean, it's a targeted move in that fashion. And it used to happen with the rice and wheat earlier. Today, probably the sugarcane has become as politically important a crop as rice and wheat. Sooner enough, potatoes will become. It all depends upon the signals which the state sends. I mean, if it sends high procurement price signals for variety X, the push is towards variety X. But I'm pretty much sure Indians consume much more than 22 varieties of crops.
And probably the last question, Bob Smith.
Thanks very much, Amitendu, for a splendidly produced diagnosis of political and governance pathology. I'd like to ask a question about how you can see markets, institutions and policies being brought together by some adventurous policy entrepreneur with the ear of a very courageous minister. Will this be as a result of natural calamity, of farmers speaking with even louder voices, with an outbreak of economic rationality in New Delhi? What's the number of factors that need to come together, and is there a feasible path forward?
Actually, to me, frankly, it's much more than the central government or government in New Delhi. Agriculture at the end of the day, and this is probably what many of us don't realize, agriculture at the end of the day, according to the Indian Constitution, is a subject that vests with the state governments. So does this APMC Acts. I mean, if the states individually can get their act together, and believe me, there are a number of Indian states which actually have taken good institutional steps in a large number of areas. Not directly related to the market institutions policy framework, but maybe individual. I mean, there are things which we did not imagine 7 or 8 years ago, for example, electronic procurement of government tenders. I mean, these are things that have happened. I don't see why this cannot happen in the larger context of the political economy of agriculture in India. The problem is that agriculture is a sector which involves so many stakeholders, each with a distinct political space and influence, that it is a nexus which is very hard to crack. I mean, let me allude to an example of another sector, the railways, where privatization has been the most difficult thing to achieve because of the very large number of vested interests associated with the railways in maintaining it as a state monopoly. So, I suppose what I would look forward to is not a question of all these things happening overnight, but probably happening even in a disconnected fashion at the level of states one by one. There are some states which are obviously going to be ahead of others. I mean, I'm an optimist, I'm not giving up hope, but I don't think this is going to happen completely, totally, exhaustively. But what I really wish is that if political parties could have stopped playing this game of taking the farmers for a ride, I don't think Indian farmers deserve that. They deserve much better. They have the capacity to compete globally, they have the capacity to serve the country well economically, and they deserve the opportunity. So if the ecosystem is provided to them, I think that's the least that political parties in India can do.
I think with that, Amitendu, we should let you off.